Welcome back to the podcast for the Athenium Book Club. And for those of you guys that saw our first episode with Alex Petkus, where we talked about Plutarch's Life of Pericles, I hope you really enjoyed that. A reminder, if you are brand new to the book club and you haven't heard of it before, you can check it out over at atheniumbooks.com. And we're going to have these podcasts every few weeks talking about a important historical book, the perspective about it, and a little bit of the author's world. Today, I'm personally very excited for this interview because the guest I have today has had a massive effect on my life. When I was in undergrad, this professor was the most fun class I ever had. And it actually, personally for me, was what drew me to classics and ended up being what I ended up doing my master's in. So today I'm excited to have Dr. Sean Lake with us today. And we're going to be looking at not just the Iliad, but also the world of Homer. So Dr. Lake, thank you for hanging out with me today, sir.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
So Dr. Lake, people that might not know who you are and what you do, if you want to tell us a little bit about your background and particularly what drew you to Homer and the Iliad in particular.
Yeah, my background is that I have a PhD in classics. That's my field of study. I got that from Fordham University. And some of the stuff I've done in my education is I attended the American School of Classical Studies. That's an archaeological program that I did in Athens for a year. Did a summer program at the American Academy in Rome, another archaeological program. And then I did the post-bac program in classics at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's my general background. So I'm a classicist, and a lot of what I have to teach is Homer. And Homer is really where everything begins. And I wrote my dissertation about the Roman poet Ovid, who sort of writes some epics. So I also chose to learn a lot about Homer during that process of doing my graduate work and taking exams and writing about it. And one of the reasons I got into classics really was that I got really interested in Dante as an undergraduate. And what I kept reading about Dante, in addition to being a Christian author, Dante knew an enormous amount about the classics, and everything that Dante knew, went back further than him. So while I kind of loved Dante, I wanted to know what Dante knew, because Dante seemed to know everything. He does know an enormous amount. And so that's what got me into, Homer and to particularly love Homer, because it's such an important text. It's the fundamental of everything else that comes after it. There's a quotation from Harold Bloom, who's a modern literary critic. And he says, everyone, regardless of race, gender, or ideology, is a son or daughter of Homer. And that's, a true statement. Whether you know Homer or not, like, you don't have to know your father to be influenced by him. You might have some of the same genes. You might have been, given up for adoption. You might never met your father, but it's still your father. And I think that's what Homer is. Homer is this figure that is in the background of every story that you know, probably to a certain extent. The people that wrote your favorite film know Homer.
Yes.
Who wrote your favorite novel knew Homer to a certain extent, most likely. And if they didn't, whoever influenced them did. It goes back. So everybody has this origin that goes back to Homer a lot in regard to storytelling.
I will say, first and foremost, I didn't know the piece about Dante with you. It's because for me, historically, I don't know, I kind of go down these rabbit holes. And the rabbit hole I'm on right now is I went through a whole lecture series about the life of Dante. And then I've been going through a whole lecture series about the world of Machiavelli, because I've been very interested in the Renaissance recently. It is really interesting because that rebirth, I think, is a big reason that we actually know a lot of what we know about that world now.
Yeah, that's right. Dante and Machiavelli are living very much in the same world, and that's a fascinating world. And that's right. The Renaissance, Dante's just in the beginning of that, the cusp of it. But right, that's the rebirth of Greek learning. People maybe know that word is as a rebirth, but they don't know it's the rebirth of Greek learning per se.
Yes,
that's when Homer's coming back in and becoming monumentally important again.
So the thing I wanted to get into for our audience, I apologize. I actually wrote my notes down this time so that I'm not trying to find them like I was during the last interview. But so we're looking at the Iliad. It's traditionally attributed to Homer, but there's an ongoing debate on who was Homer really. Can you kind of walk us through the historical and scholarly perspectives on who Homer was? Was he a single poet, a collective of storytellers, or something else entirely?
Yeah, and my overall thesis statement that I would maybe start with is that the Iliad isn't what most people think it is. So you're asking, for example, about the author. I don't know that we have an author. And that's a funny answer. But what most people would say today that are deep into the scholarship of Homer is there may have been a genius at one point who was the architect of this song. Another thing that people don't understand about the Homeric poems, the epics, is a better maybe term to refer to them, is that they're songs. That in all likelihood, these were sung and probably even meant to be danced to. There's evidence for both those things that are very strong. But the author, just to start with that, the Iliad is traditionally attributed to Homer, but there's an ongoing debate about who he really was or if he existed. The composition might have looked something like this. There was a long phase where you had an oral songwriter who was most likely illiterate. And the reason I say this is because in 1928, there's a scholar called Milman Parry. He went to the former Yugoslavia and he found essentially epic poets, songwriters that could sing 16,000 line songs, which is about the Iliad. And they were illiterate songwriters. They were illiterate. They couldn't read or write, but they could tell this story from memory that they had learned as part of a tradition. And if they were asked to tell it twice, they could tell it twice, and it would largely be the same, but not entirely the same, which is a fascinating element of it. That meant they were able to improvise, or they forgot certain portions, or they were able to extemporaneously create new portions. So this is a fascinating amount of brain power that these guys had. So it might have looked something like this. The Trojan War, we have very solid evidence that ends around 1188 BC. And we can talk about that. You can, look up an article that you'll find in places like National Geographic and Scientific American that talks about the day that Odysseus returned home 10 years after the war. Wow. And that's because he talks about an eclipse. You can start to talk about constellations. You can look at the archaeological evidence. You can look at the ancient date of the scholar called Eratosthenes. He's the first person that measured the earth accurately. And he dated the Trojan War to 1184. So it's somewhere around 1184, 1188. We know with some precision. So there's that layer of it. That's when there was a Trojan War. We have archaeological evidence for that. We have physical evidence for that. Is there somebody named Homer composing at that age? The scholarly opinion is generally no, there wasn't a long epic written at that time, composed at that time. Again, I shouldn't say written because it's oral composition at this first phase. Sure. After you go through the late Bronze Age, I date the late Bronze Age around 2100 BC, 1625 BC to 1188, fall of Troy. You have a 400-year Dark Age, a collapse, a late Bronze Age collapse, some people will call it. 400 years where things go backwards, where writing systems that the Greeks had, for example, disappear, where the population seems to decrease, where monumental architecture seems to decrease, where people may be living like hunter and gatherers after achieving a very high level of civilization, even in Greece. Interesting. So there's a Trojan War, a massive collapse with the Hittites around this time. The Egyptians are having trouble this time. Greece has evidence of trouble this time. 400 years of going backwards. A lot of people think that history is always moving forward. It's always advancing, but this is a major backwards phase of human history in that Mediterranean region, from Sicily to Israel and the Near East in general, Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Turkey, modern Turkey. So you've got this backwards phase for about 400 years. But again, the song probably is continuing at this point because it's about the Trojan War. It's possible that there was no original song dating back to the late Bronze Age or the Dark Age, but that seems rather unlikely to me that there wasn't some ongoing tradition. But it's possible. Sure. That first phase, maybe there was somebody named Homer there, but that's not generally what scholars say about it. There's early songwriters and oral singers. They're singing this to musical accompaniment of a pharynx, maybe a lyre. And we have pictures of this, and we have interestingly, in the Odyssey, we have a description of a singer in the Odyssey itself, a blind singer. We'll get to that point later, who's singing about the war of Troy. Then we get a pretty specific description of these figures called rhapsodes. And they're working at one event that Athens is holding under the tyrant Pisistratus called the Pan-Athenaic Festival. In Athens, the Pan-Athenaic Festival. And among other things that this festival has, athletic games, it has Homeric recitation, Homeric songs. And there's some idea that we have that this was done in an order and it was done in an orderly fashion. And there might have even been an attempt to record these songs that were otherwise just in people's brains at this time. There's an idea that there's a Pisistratid edition or recension that comes about around this time. That's about the 6th century BC in Athens. So you go from 1188, 400 years of who knows what's going on, this Dark Age. Then the Archaic Age. Archaic means beginning. There's like a new beginning. The world starts over again. Starting around 776 with the first Olympics. And about 100 years after that, we have this tyrant Pisistratus, maybe a little bit longer than that, who is organizing this festival for the Athenians, and it includes these songwriters or singers that perform the Homeric songs. And the word rhapsodes has been interpreted as having to do with stitching together. The idea being that maybe they're taking little episodes and then combining them, or that they're taking parts of the ancient tradition and then making longer songs out of them. You know, they're coming out of the Dark Age, or at any rate, somewhere around the Archaic Age is when most scholars would say there was a singular genius named Homer who might be the architect of at least the Iliad, if not also the Odyssey. And that would be around that same time that these rhapsodes are walking around. We also have evidence of these so-called Homeridae. The idai ending means, you know, the descendants of or the sons of. So these sons of Homer, which would imply like they're apprentices of this tradition, this singing tradition, this oral poet, where you have 16,000 lines. And that would take you about 2 hours a day for like 14 days.
Wow.
Whole thing. And I look up this once in a while. I mean, that's about how many hours of songs somebody like Bob Dylan has created in his lifetime.
Wow.
Now, does Bob Dylan have his whole set list in his head at all times? I don't know that he does. You know, that would be an impressive feat. I know that Bob Dylan's set list in the past has tended to be pretty varying, but I don't know that you could shout out any one of his songs and he could perform the whole thing, you know?
Yeah.
Or perform it well. So it's a prodigious accomplishment that these early singers, and if there's a Homer, that he's doing. There's also the idea of what does this name mean? One idea is that this word Homer has to do with Greek roots, meaning like he's the joiner, almost the wheel maker, like the wagon wheel maker, which is really interesting if we talk about the fact that the Homeric poems have so much ring composition. They'll start an idea, and then they'll digress, and they'll have a second idea, and then they'll have a third image or idea, and then they'll do it all in reverse. And this can be
very similar to Dante, by the way, which is quite interesting, just to add as a side note.
Right. And Dante's certainly studying this. There's a passage in the Homeric poems that I'll mention for sure where it says mankind is like the generation of leaves, and that starts in the Iliad, and then Virgil copies it, and then Dante copies it. So Dante's certainly a student, probably not of the Greek. He doesn't seem to, have direct access to it, but he has, enough sense of what it's like. And he has largely a sense of what it's like through Virgil. But anyway, to go back to it, so you've got this early phase, at least 3 layers of composition, late Bronze Age, probably. And you have evidence of that. I say that especially because you have evidence of that in the poem itself, in the songs itself. You have allusions to bronze armor. But then you also have this layer of the Dark Age where they start using iron a lot more in Greece. And it's not because iron is better, it's because it's available. Iron is more brittle and rusts, and it's not really as desirable as bronze, but they start using iron in this Dark Age, and you have iron weapons side by side in Homer with Bronze Age weapons. You have things like a boar's tusk helmet, which seems really old-fashioned and primitive, and then you have sophisticated bronze weapons and the shield of Achilles, which is as elaborate as it's made by a god. It's so elaborate. And then you have these layer of the Archaic Age, and so you have these traditions of poets going around, and what the name Homer might mean is the wheelmaker or the joiner, which is very similar to this idea of the rhapsode, the stitcher or the joiner. So there's something in the etymological meaning of these words that suggest that these songs may have existed in maybe a lot of different bards had different versions of this, and then somebody joined them together, maybe Homer, or maybe Homer's the first person to write them down, or maybe there's an individual at one point, maybe his name was Homer, that wrote these down, or maybe this name Homer is a made-up name to suggest the nature of whoever created these things. Like, I always, when I talk about Homer, I always, ask my students, for example, like, who invented the television? Who invented the internal combustion engine? We have no idea. Most people, like, it's on your tongue. Who invented the internet? I mean, there's a humorous answer. You could get Bill Gates. Yeah. But it's like, who really is behind some of these things that we use? And nobody retains a tradition of who invented the wheel and so forth. Right? And so, who was the first person to sing the songs of Troy? Maybe there is no person that anybody knows, but the name eventually settled on Homer.
Well, I think the thing that's really interesting here is it does show you a lot of how the, I guess, AD imagination works, if that makes sense, when you're looking at kind of BC history versus AD history. Because Mary Beard, when she's discussing the 7 traditional kings of Rome, she says historically, if you look at it, that the last 6 are actually the more likely to have been around, right? When she looks at Romulus, he's kind of this Mr. Rome character, this person that they tie all these different things to because they don't know whether he exists or not, but they don't also know where their traditions came from. So when you look at kind of these early works, a lot of times it's also something for them to tie their traditions to that they can't explain.
Right. Exactly. So sometimes there seems to be these characters, like if you look at the stories of Theseus in early Athens, he's doing major events like the Homeric poems, songs over 3 different ages, over 1,000 years. And that's just impossible. But I think this might just be this, figure that they use to explain a lot of things that they don't remember.
Well, so one thing I want to mention before we dive into the actual Iliad itself is, because I do think it's important to understand this world. Can we talk a bit about the Greek imagination and how they looked at the idea of gods and men? Because I think that in itself is important too, how a certain way that they saw how gods and men interacted. Can we just put a little color to that?
Yeah, you do see elements of the religion and the worldview in the Iliad, where humans interact with supernatural creatures, with these gods. So it's a fascinating way. You have a later author, Xenophanes, a philosopher in Greece, talking derogatorily about how Homer and Hesiod invented the gods. And, what he is implying is that this is where you see a depiction of these supernatural creatures that are interacting with mankind on a daily basis, on a regular basis. In the very opening of the Iliad, Achilles is angry with Agamemnon. He thinks about killing him, and he's stopped by Athena. And nobody else can see Athena, but Athena appears to Achilles and changes his mind on something. So that's the kind of depiction that you have. When I was studying Homer, I was struck very often by scholars who say that, it's not a very supernatural, world in Homer. But I think that's not true. I think it's a very supernatural world. Maybe when you get into the world of classics and you're studying Homer all the time, you just start to take this for granted. But yes, it's a very strange world where you're speaking to gods all the time.
Yeah. So if we could take a look, I know this is, I guess, a bit more high level, but when we're looking high level at the Iliad, can we kind of just describe what the plot looks like and kind of just take a look at a few of the main characters, such as like, Agamemnon, Hector, and Achilles, to kind of just set the stage here for our conversation.
Yeah. And I'll give you a short version and a long version of that.
And can I just say, by the way, that the reason I was excited to particularly do this subject with you is I remember, and this is back in like 2008 or something like that. I remember walking into your class and you were reciting this poem from memory, and everybody's like, "What is happening right now? What is this guy doing?" So I was very excited to dive into this with you.
Yeah, and I'll give you like a kind of very simple overview, which I think is helpful, and then I'll give you an original kind of version of it, which
Sure.
you can take or leave. But I think it's an insightful thing, and what I think is important about the Iliad is that it's a very practical book. It's a very practical thing to read, and I'll explain why I think that. So the big picture, the easy, very concrete plot is that it's the 10th year of the siege of Troy by these Mycenaean late Bronze Age Greeks. They're trying to get Helen back, who was taken from her husband, Menelaus, and by a Trojan prince, Paris or Alexander. It's a complicated and maybe unresolved question as to why he's got different names. So the Greeks go and besiege the city for 10 years. They're trying to get Helen back. Everybody who ever courted Helen made an agreement that if she was ever kidnapped, because she had been kidnapped by Theseus when she was much younger, if she were ever kidnapped, they would go rescue her. So that's the kind of origin of this whole thing. Why is Helen such a big deal? Menelaus should just get over it. They're in the 10th year, and while the Greeks are besieging Troy, it's taking 10 years. It's costly in manpower, costly in money. And they're living off the land. They're raiding local towns. They're, stealing daughters from local towns. They're getting concubines. Ajax has a concubine that he kind of seems to love and almost treats her as his wife. And they have a son together in the course of this war. And Achilles has a girl that he has. And Agamemnon has a girl that he has. Well, the father of the girl that Agamemnon stole, abducted, kidnapped, prays to Apollo and says, punish these Greeks and bring a plague upon them. And Apollo does so. And everybody realizes, well, Agamemnon, you got to give up this girl. You got to send her away. And Agamemnon doesn't want to do that. And Achilles says, you got to do it. And Agamemnon loses his temper and says, okay, I'll give her up. I'll sacrifice for that, but I'm taking the girl from you, Achilles. And Achilles thinks of murdering Agamemnon for this. And this whole conflict, which seems so petty, it's it's just about this horrific practice in warfare of abducting these girls to be sexual partners during the campaign.
Wow.
That's what the Iliad is. That's the pretext for this the Iliad, and it backfires completely on Achilles. So he gives up the girl who's kind of almost forcefully taken from him. And then he goes off and pouts. I mean, you can use a fancy German word like Schadenfreude. He takes pleasure in the Greeks needing him because they have great setbacks once he leaves and his troops leave. Or you can just say he pouts because it's really like he's a petulant child who's going off to pout in his tents and he's not going to, play anymore with the rest of the Greeks. He gives up his girl, but he's not going to fight for Agamemnon anymore. This leads to his kinsman, and the person that I would describe him as the person he loves most in this world, Patroclus. Patroclus says, all right, the Greeks are really losing here. I'm going to dress up in your armor, put some fear into them, and I'm going to help the Greeks for a little while. And then Achilles says, fine, put on my armor, but don't go too far. He warns him. Patroclus enters in the battle. He doesn't listen to Achilles. He goes too far. And the main hero of the Trojan side, Hector, kills him. And that's a devastating loss, obviously. And as a result of his anger, Achilles loses and costs the life of the person he loves most in this world. Then Achilles has to get new armor from a god. That's an interesting and important scene because his shield depicts all of life, all of human life in a little little a decoration on the shield. Achilles goes back into battle. He avenges the death of Patroclus, kills Hector, tries to really hurt everyone in Troy, especially Hector's parents, by dragging his body, the dead body of Hector, around. And Hector is depicted as a great father and a great brother and a great son and handsome and smart and fast and brave. So, Homer doesn't really have, good guys and bad guys. The Trojans and the Greeks are pretty equal. War is the terrible thing that's going on with these people. And, but God protect Hector's body and keep it from being defiled. The old king of Troy, Priam, wants his son's body back. So he sneaks in to Achilles' tent in the night with the help of God. And Achilles, of course, at first wants to cut his throat, but he reconsiders because, and this to me is the key moment, he looks into the eyes of the old man who's lost his son, and he's got literally, I don't know, how many sons does he have? 100 some? He looks into the eyes of Priam, the king of Troy, old man who's mourning the loss of his son Hector, and Achilles thinks, this is what my father's eyes are going to look like when he finds out that I'm dead. At age 21 or 18 or however old he is. He's a young man is the point. Too young to die, and he's great. He's impressive. Achilles is not a likable character by any means. He's the hero, but he's not, like, Hector is good and admirable and likable. And Achilles is very unlikable for most of this work. But he finally develops some degree of empathy, and he agrees to. He has a meal with Priam, shares his food with him, agrees to give the body back, and then the story really ends with these funeral games for Patroclus, and a kind of a good resolution to the anger that Achilles had between Agamemnon. Now that's a very concrete synopsis of it. What I think is practical about it, and a message that can inform the way you live your life. I've heard it put this way, not about the Iliad per se, but about anger. Anger only hurts the vessel in which it's contained. Mm-hmm. So you're walking around this anger, and the name Ankyleos, which is, a kind of exaggerated and bad pronunciation of a Greek original for Achilles, has something to do with that same root for anger and anxiety in it. And the very first word of the Iliad is Manen, which has this MN root in it. And it'll be translated, translators will try to find a one-word translation of it, but you can't do that with that word. It's a word for anger, but it's in particular the kind of anger that you don't forget about. It's a grudge, which is, I think, a really important point. This is not just anger, or sometimes it's translated rage or translated as wrath. Those are all, to me, lousy attempts to translate this word, which is crucial, because the word means the kind of anger that you hold on to, that eats you away, that backfires on you. What happens when Ankyleos, the anger of the peoples, what that name means, something like that, or angry at the people, or whatever, you want to translate that as. Those are the two seeming roots of it. Now that might be a false etymology, but again, sometimes these false etymologies are still informative because that's what ancient people might think about these words. The first word of it is this kind of anger that you don't let go, and it completely and utterly backfires on Achilles. He ruins his own life. He loses the life of the person he loves most in this world because he cannot let go of this anger. What's fascinating is that the name Agamemnon has that same MN root in it, Agamemnon. His brother, who can't let go of this wife that really, in most versions, willingly abandons him, is named Menelaus. It's got the same MN root in it. Agamemnon comes home 10 years later after this war, and his wife Clytemnestra has got the same MN root in it, murders him because she's held on to a grudge for all these years. So you have this all these root words that remind you of this anger that's held there. And then Patroclus himself whose name means, famous because of his father or something like that. His father's name is Menoetius, this MN root yet again. So you got Achilles' name has to do with anger, probably, and Patroclus, his father, has this MN root in it, and Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and Menelaus, all these prominent figures are mired down in this anger that they can't let go of. And as you go on, you see this preposterous pretext for the wrath of Achilles, the opening lines, the main of Achilles. It's in book 6 where you have this crucial passage that I mentioned earlier that's in the Iliad and in Dante's Divine Comedy, where it compares mankind to the generation of leaves. In other words, the imagery suggests that you're very short-lived compared to these gods that are eternal. Your life is like a season. And then you have the death of these figures like Sarpedon, who's described as just this great warrior, really admirable. He's the son of Zeus, and Zeus almost intervenes to stop the death of Sarpedon. There's vase paintings depicting the death of Sarpedon because it's an important enough moment. But again, what you're reminded of is that war is taking away the lives of these people of such great potential in their peak of their youth.
Sure.
Then you have the untimely and undeserved death of Patroclus, who again, while Achilles is off pouting and just hurting, is his schadenfreude, wallowing in joy that his comrades are suffering, Patroclus tries to go and fight for his side on behalf, of Achilles, essentially, and he gets murdered, cut down in the prime of his youth. Such a better person than Achilles is. He's a better friend. Then Achilles gets back into battle, makes up with Agamemnon, at least superficially, enough to want to go fight because he wants to avenge the death of Patroclus. And then he cuts down Hector. And again, Hector is depicted as this loving father and great husband, dutiful son, prince of Troy, eldest of all of Priam's, masses of children, the golden child of that whole nation. And he's dead at a young age. Then you have in book 21, you have a closing to this where it again reminds you ring composition. Book 6, book 21, mankind is like the generation of leaves. And in between that, you just have these moments of these harsh examples, these scenes of people being cut down in war long before, their time, the strongest and the best of a generation. So that's one of the things that I look at it. And then when you get to Priam coming into the tent of Achilles finally, I don't know if he doesn't forgive Priam, the king of Troy, father of Hector, but he does develop at least a significant degree of empathy.
Well, it feels like mercy in a lot of ways, I would say. Like he has
a great word for it. Yeah.
I think it seems like he doesn't release the grudge, but he seems to have mercy for understanding the condition he's in.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. He has mercy and he has an understanding of his own condition because he knows the entire song, the entire epic. He knows he's going to die young. His mother tells him every once in a while, why don't you just go home? You could live to be an old age. You could have a great wife. You'd rule your father's kingdom. And he's like, yeah, but my character is such that I'm going to die. I'm going to die here because that's who I am. It's like Heraclitus says, your character is your destiny. You can't escape that. Achilles can't escape that, even though he's told by a divine creature that, hey, you could get out of here. Just leave. He's like, nah, yeah, I get it, but I can't. I won't. And so, right, he has this recognition, this empathy is how I like to think of it, but I think mercy is also an important element of that. And a good element of it. Because the whole time you can't like Achilles before this. But at this moment, then you can see what the hero is. The hero is the person that undergoes a massive personal transformation and goes from being selfish, childish, and mean-spirited, petty, to actually having empathy for another human being and mercy for another human. And that's how I would tell the story as far as what's it have the meaning to you. The message to me is in a practical way, because you can read these things and you can be nerdy about it and have a lot of fun getting into all the mythology and the names. I mean, there's at least 70 backstories that you hear, miss about Hercules and Thebes and Oedipus that are alluded to briefly in this Iliad. Um, but but really, like, in a practical way, what I think is valuable about it is, like, don't hold on to grudges and have empathy. And I love your idea of mercy. It's not something I've been focused on, but I think that's a great word for it. It's another good quality. It's another great quality that you can glean in the end, not in the beginning from Achilles, but in the end, you see this person develop. Hector, I know somebody who says, well, Hector's the real hero of the Iliad. And I can understand that point, but I don't think Hector's as interesting. Hector is like somebody that nobody can be. Nobody can be as perfect as Hector. Nobody's tall and good looking and got great ethics and is a perfect child and is a great husband and never screws up as a dad and he's brave on the battlefield. Nobody's like that.
Well, he starts at the end of the hero's journey, right? Like that's been a complaint about a lot of modern movies is a lot of modern movies start with this person that's already so developed, there is no hero's journey, right? And if Achilles is somebody that goes through this hero's journey of developing this person, he should be.
Right. And how could you really identify with somebody that's already perfect? You are always probably trying for self-improvement, but you can't really identify with somebody that's already there, that's already great. Most people are, unless they're, arrogant and just, have no sense of humility or sense of self, they don't think they're already finished. They're on a journey. They're on a path. They're on a path of personal transformation.
So I guess when we look at the Iliad and kind of look at its historical impact, right? Like the first thing that comes to mind for me is the stories of Alexander the Great and how he saw himself and Hephaestion, who was his kinsman, as Patroclus and Achilles. And we also see in his life a lot of the different things he did to try and be like Achilles. But when we look at the Iliad, what is kind of the impact on, I guess, history after it's written?
Well, some scholars in later years in the modern era will refer to it as the Bible, the Greeks. It becomes the most important text. Plato, to me, really spends a lot of his writings arguing with the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think one of the things he does is depict um, uh, Socrates as a better alternative to somebody like Odysseus. But when Plato's doing that, or maybe if Socrates himself was making this point, because I know Plato writes about his main character is often Socrates, and it's because Socrates is a real person. He's depicting his qualities. But Plato's arguing against the establishment when he's doing that. So the establishment of thought, like Xenophanes again criticizes, Homer and Hesiod invent the gods. It's like they create what we think of as the gods now because they're so influential, because it's such a impactful thing. Remember this Pan-Athenaic festival in Athens, they're holding this regular festival to perform the Homeric songs because they're so important, because they're such a part of the cultural inheritance. It's the history of the Greek people. It's, again, teaching you norms. It's teaching you values. Again, a lot of what education doesn't do today. There's a book that I think is a very good book called Norms and Nobility, is that the Homeric poems are teaching you, the epics are teaching you these norms and what the qualities of a good human being are, that you can learn from that. So it becomes the establishment of the education system in some ways, because these are the stories by which you can learn. And again, one of the points that Norms and Nobility makes is that, you can tell your child don't lie, or you can tell them the story of the boy that cried wolf, and it's going to stick a lot better, and they're going to have an image and a engaging story that's going to make it more real to them. They're going to say, "Oh, I get the consequences." You just tell a child not to lie. Don't lie.
Yeah.
That's not the same as when you show them this story. Look what happened to Achilles.
Yes.
Achilles held that anger and that grudge, and he went off and pouted. Well, what did that cost him? Cost him the person he loved most in this world. So, that's what the implications of the Homeric songs are, among other things. There's the history is contained in that. So the Greeks thought of that as real history, and it is. I mean, those stories seem fictionalized, and they have supernatural elements in them that are fictional, and they have different layers that aren't real. They have, problematic elements. Like Homer doesn't seem to know how Bronze Age chariots would work. He describes them as like, taxi cabs that take you to the front lines. You can jump off and fight on foot. So they're not the greatest means for a modern historian to reconstruct antiquity. But again, for the ancient audience, it was an engaging story that everyone knew that brings your culture together with a common ground.
So I guess when we're looking at the Odyssey as well, I don't want to get into all the themes of the Odyssey here, but I guess how would you say the difference in theme compares to the Iliad, and as well, do we think the authorship is similar, or because obviously they're both attributed to Homer, or how do those two compare?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's one scholar that says that, the author of the Odyssey is a woman. And there's these two camps. People refer to them as Unitarians. I think there's one author for everything. And then, in fact, there was 13 songs in the epic cycle in total, 8 just on Troy itself. And are they all attributed to Homer? They were by some people in antiquity, but 13 songs. I mean, the Iliad is 16,000 lines on its own. And again, there's people that think that Shakespeare can't have written all of his works, but is there really hard evidence that he didn't? Some people may be that prolific and impressive. Plutarch is an author that I think of that. How could one person in one lifetime write so much incredible information on such a variety of topics? So maybe there's a singular genius that is able to do this and it just flows out of him. Or maybe the Iliad is the singular creation of one person. Maybe the Odyssey is the singular creation of another person. Or maybe these things, again, get stitched together. One of the reasons people think they're stitched together is there are absolute glaring inconsistencies. The Latin poet Horace said, even good Homer nods, like he dozes off while he's writing. Because you'll have figures that are dead, and then and then a little while later they're alive again. It's like you ever see a film where, I remember some TV show, maybe it was Star Trek, the scar was on one side of the character's face in one scene, and then a few minutes later the scar was on the other side of the guy's face. So it's like a continuity editor is absent from Homer. There's a passage that's famous in the Iliad where there's 2 people walking along. They're going to go talk to Achilles, and they're using this Greek verb form called the dual, where it's limited to 2, like the twain. Like the twain is clearly 2. And the twain of them are walking, the twain of them are talking, and the twain of them are almost there. And then the third guy all of a sudden says, and people are like, where did the third guy come from? Like they're half a mile from camp, and this guy just run up. There's no nuisance. So there's internal evidence that these things are perhaps stitched together to a certain extent. But I don't like pulling it apart too much, and I don't think that's the trend on the scholarship either. There's people that say, well, book 9 doesn't belong, and this part of book 24 doesn't belong, and this sentence right here can't have been written by Homer. And that was happening even in antiquity in the 2nd century, 3rd century, and 2nd century BC in Alexandria, Egypt, at this great library that was there. Even at that point, they were trying to piece together the authoritative text of the Iliad. And to this day, there's people that are going through, the manuscripts that we have, maybe about 200, and trying to collate them and figure out what the real Homeric text is. But it doesn't seem to be that there's a real Homeric text. It seems to be that every performance was somewhat unique. Like the 4th word of the Odyssey, that's where we have our first variation. It's not like every few books there's a few words that are different. It's like on the 4th word of the Odyssey, you're already saying, well, what's the right choice here? Because one manuscript says this, another manuscript says that. It's probably because there's so many different authors and rhapsodes and Homeridae and individuals going around performing these things.
So I guess when we're comparing it to the Odyssey, then how would you say the themes compare? Are they similar themes? Do they change, or I guess does the writing style change? What would you say the Iliad and the Odyssey as a comparison point?
The big picture, the one is about the evolution of a kind of rotten guy, Achilles, and the Odyssey is about the evolution of a pretty rotten guy, Odysseus. And in the end, they change their ways. They go through a personal transformation. So they become self-aware and they have an improvement in their overall, MO. In the details, the Odyssey is about the homecoming. It's kind of much more fantastic. He's fighting cyclopses and water creatures and living with this witch for a while. It's much more
It's fantastic, I think, in a lot more ways.
fantastic. And the Iliad is more like, here's the gruesomeness of war and the horrors of war. And then the Odyssey is much more about the homecoming of a veteran, as far as a relevant, and meaningful message today. Like, I'll say this too about both of those works and what the Greeks and eventually do. Like most art, except for a lot of modern art, which is either goes too far in its violence or sexuality or public art statues that are just blobs of twisted metal. Like most art, it's therapeutic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a VA psychiatrist named Jonathan Shea who writes a great book called Odysseus in America, and he also writes another one called Achilles in Vietnam. And he's a VA psychiatrist, and he says, the Greek tragedy was invented as a form of cultural therapy, like expressive arts therapy is another term for this, arguably. Cultural therapy for, of, and by veterans in particular. So what you have in both of these songs is these tragic events that would have been familiar to the ancient Greek people, because it was 100% participation in combat and in your own territory. Like, in the United States, there's less than 1% of the population serves in the military. The wars are places on the map that a lot of Americans can't identify.
Yes.
I've been in the room with educated people that were high school teachers, and not a slight against high school teachers per se. I'm just trying to give you the background. And they didn't know where Iraq was, the majority of people. And, your neighbors in Iraq, and your money's going to Iraq, and there's a war being fought there by your nation. And a lot of Americans are just oblivious to that. In Athens, let's say that's not the case. They're all participating. And it's in their own territory, outside their own city walls in many, many, many instances. So what these songs are, these Homeric songs, they eventually, a lot of those myths get taken into tragedy. And Jonathan Shea argues that these songs were performed and put out there because they were therapeutic.
Mm-hmm.
They're giving you a taste of what you went through in a fictional context and in a group therapy. And in the case of tragedy, you're having a little bit of wine. And the Greeks thought of wine as a medicine for the psyche. That was a physical medicine, but they also thought of it as a wine. So that might be a slippery slope, right? I wouldn't recommend anybody use alcohol as a form of mental health medication. But you can see what it means, right? You can drink away your problems. The problem, the problem with that is that you become addicted to it and it's hard on your health.
Sure.
But the Greeks thought of it as, you can use wine as a medicine for mental health. They literally describe it as a medicine for grief in medical textbooks, ancient Greek textbooks. And in Greek tragedies, they describe it as a pharmaca for, grief. So it's an interesting idea is that what both of those things do, you're asking me to compare the Iliad and Odyssey, that the big picture, there are stories about personal transformation, and there's stories about war, and they're therapeutic for the people that have lived through war. The civilians, the women and children that are behind the walls, is maybe more the focus, let's say, the Odyssey, because it's about homecoming and what's going on the home front, while Odysseus is trying to get back home. And the Iliad is, what's going on in the actual combat itself. And it's about the reintegration of a civilian into society, and Odysseus has a hard time with that.
Well, the last thing I want to get into here before we end off is, one of the big themes we look at with this book club is things that we can take into our modern world and use as kind of life advice, or, things we can apply to our life. And I guess if we look at what we can gain from the Iliad, how can we apply this in our modern world, and how does it, have good influence on us?
Yeah, I think that the idea is that it's very difficult for most people to get into the Iliad, because you're going to have a lot of repetition. You're going to have names that are no longer familiar. We've lost that in our culture. It's long. It's technically song lyrics or poetry. And so therefore, it doesn't read as smoothly as a novel. It's not written in the style of modern novels that people are familiar with. If Harry Potter is easy for you to read, the Iliad isn't going to be easy for you to read still. Might be a person that likes to read. The Iliad is still going to be foreign and strange. But what you need to understand is that this is a work that if you can get past the barriers of the repetitious language, which is because it's oral poetry and it makes it easier for the poet to compose spontaneously and to memorize. So they'll say rosy fingered dawn like 20 times in the course of the poem because that's an easy way to fit into, a line of this dactylic hexameter meter, this poetic meter. If you can get past that, then what you're going to see is you're going to see something that has the timeless issues that people are still confronting. You're still dealing with, and in particular, this has to do with war in many instances. But when you have the shield of Achilles, for example, and kind of in the center of the poem, after Patroclus dies and his armor is stripped from him, very common practice in ancient warfare, you take the armor as a trophy. What you have is when he gets his new armor, he's got this shield, and the shield has the city at peace and the city at war on it. And it has children at play, and it has old men. And it has the lives of women, and it has the lives of men. And it has, it has all the seasons. It's, and it's done in this ring, just like Homer composes these vast rings, where book 6, he mentions the generation of leaves, and book 21, he closes that ring. And in between, you have all these instances of young men dying before their time. You have this depiction really that does touch on a lot of the key issues of life, because we have cell phones and we have the internet and we have helicopters, but the real things that have not changed are there's injustice, there is sex, there is war, there is people that die too young, there is the joy of having children. All those issues. I mean, Odysseus spends 20 years, away from his child. He spends 20 years away from his dog, and so the Iliad touches upon all the things that are timeless. What the things that don't change are, some days you have good days and some days you have bad days. Some days, you're bickering with your wife, and other days, you're so in love. Some days your children are obedient. Some days your children are problematic. And none of these things change. And the Iliad is one of the masterpieces that have survived the test of time. The Greeks have a word, aletheia. And it's the word Jesus uses when he talks about truth. It's the high truth, because there's a different word for truth in Greek, atumos. It's the serious word for truth. But what it literally means is that which is not forgotten. And so everything that the Iliad addresses are the issues that are aletheia, the issues that are too important to be forgotten, the issues that are timeless. When Achilles goes through this betrayal in the chain of command with Agamemnon, or feeling betrayed, that is still the kind of, issue that veterans face today. When Odysseus has to come home and deal with a society that hasn't seen the war that he's seen or gone through the struggles he's seen, that's still a relevant issue to this day. When you're worried about whether, your wife is faithful to you, or when you're miss your father and your mother, these are the same exact issues. Achilles looks into Priam's eyes and he thinks about his old father, hearing the disastrous news of his untimely death. So, that's what I would say is the wealth of the Iliad. The Iliad can teach you about ancient Greece. And that's interesting, because then you can look at yourself. Is my society like ancient Greece? It is more than most people probably realize. It can teach you about yourself, because the issues that are at the heart of this, the emotions have not changed. People still feel anger.
Yes.
The Iliad is a meditation on the disastrous consequences of holding your grudges, among other things. People are still at war. So what you have in the Iliad and all the Homeric works are these timeless issues that are relevant to you personally, relevant to you culturally. There's a quotation from Livy and or Polybius, where they say, let me see, Polybius is the one that says, men have no more ready corrective of their conduct than knowledge of the past. The surest and indeed only method of learning how to bear bravely the vicissitudes of fortune is to recall the calamities of others.
Wow.
So that's what the Iliad is. The best way to bravely deal with the ups and downs in your life is to recall the calamities of others. How did Odysseus deal with this? How did Achilles deal with that? And it's not just good examples, because then Livy says there's an exceptionally beneficial and fruitful advantage to be derived from the study of the past. He doesn't say history per se, just study of the past, mythology. There you see, set in the clear light of historical truth, examples of every possible type. And from these, you can select for yourself and your country what to imitate, and also what, as being mischievous in its inception and disastrous in its consequences, you should avoid. So you find examples of every possible type. And that's what you're getting out of these things. You have an historical document teach you about Greece. Greece is informative to the United States today. Any place in the world, really, today has been influenced by Greece to some extent. And then you have the bigger picture where this is a masterpiece of the human condition. It's not going to go out of style. It's difficult for people to read today. Yeah, it's not going to go out of style.
Well, I would say too, it wasn't written that long ago, but Will Durant's also really hard for people to read modernly too. So it's our literacy has changed dramatically.
People don't read and they can't read, and many people are functionally illiterate. So right, the Iliad is a big barrier to even get into the Iliad, but it's worth it. And I have students all the time that they've read about the Iliad in their high school, let's say, but they don't read the Iliad or the Odyssey per se in many cases. So this is a tragic and devastating thing, because then you're losing the common denominator that makes your culture your culture. That's, again, what aletheia is, the things that are not forgotten. But if the things that are so crucial, Cicero says to remain ignorant of what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. So you're going to have a childish society. Goethe says he who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living hand to mouth, meaning you're intellectually impoverished. If you can't draw on those 3,000 years of human experience, you're trying to learn it all yourself. It's like waking up every day and trying to devise a way to tie your shoes. You don't need to do that. It's already been done.
Yeah.
Apple at one point was trying to reinvent the wheel. It's like, don't waste your time. We have a wheel that works. So, that's not what you want to do. You want to draw upon 3,000 years, and you want to be a sophisticated adult. And to do that, this literature, again, I referenced that idea of norms and nobility. This literature is a means for you to know what's normal and what's noble, what's good quality. It's a way to get your ethics and virtues and values in line, because these people ultimately behave in ways that are admirable. Or again, just like Livy points out, they behave in ways that are abominable, and you need to learn how to avoid that.
Absolutely. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. For people watching, if they want to find out more about what you're doing, I guess, how can they do that, or how can they find out more about, what you're working on?
They can contact me. You can, email me at ShawneeLake@gmail. That's just my personal email. I'm working on a project, a nonprofit that I call the Hercules Project, and people can look that up. That's trying to help veterans and serve veterans, and it's working specifically with what I alluded to, the Greek tragedies. Doing forms of Greek tragedies, and doing that with the help of psychologists and therapists and counselors. Using these texts, like I said, to be means of guiding people to better behavior and understanding of themselves and reflection on themselves. I mean, that's the point of the stuff. Literature has become, you read it sometimes, and you read it in a high school class or a college class, and you take some exam on it or write some paper, and you never think about it again because it's not practical or applicable to your life, but it is. That's what I think is largely lost in a lot of the culture today. The pop culture it's not aware of this, the value of it. I had a dean at a school that I worked at referred to the humanities as low hanging fruit, and it's the humanities is teaching you to be a human being. You can get job training, but you still have to be a human being on that job, and you have to be a human being when you come home from that job.
Yes.
So that's what that is. But yeah, I'm happy to have people reach out to me or look into that Hercules project work that I'm doing, and talk more about these topics.
Very cool. And for all of you watching, reminder, if you have not joined the book club yet, the way you can do that is by going to atheniumbooks.com. We're going to have more of these episodes coming out in the future. I was very excited about this one, so I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. So Dr. Lake, thanks for spending some time with us today. And as for those of you out there listening, don't forget to catch our next one, and have a great day.
Well, such a pleasure. Thank you.